Good day to you. Did you enjoy the Super Bowl last night? Most of you, probably not all of you, but most of you watched the Super Bowl. Did you enjoy the halftime show? All the resurrection of all those hip hop artists from the 80s and the 90s all on one stage together? Pretty incredible performance, in my point of view. We didn't have, come to think of it, people on that halftime show who were philosophers, did we? No, we had rappers. Did we have people who were poets? No, we didn't have people who were poets. Did we have people who were crisis counselors occupying halftime show for the TV audience? No, we didn't have them either. So I'm making fun of this idea, right? But am I really? Am I really making fun of all these things that we didn't have, or am I also saying that what we had were entertainment figures? Entertainment figures who are part of the selling process of the Super Bowl. The selling process, what is for sale during the Super Bowl? You're for sale. And that's how this chapter approaches what we're going to talk about today, which is power and political economy in social media. We're using the example of the Super Bowl, but it's going to apply to social media today, that we're going to be talking about you today. And we're going to be talking about you in a really deep, and you may consider to be a dark way, though it's not meant to be. It's meant to be in an enlightening way, but you're going to be talking about things that are not that easy to discuss. You're going to be learning and continuing to learn the language of Marxist theory when it comes to describing capital accumulation. There's that term again, capital accumulation in social media, and how capital accumulation organizes your life, at least your life as it pertains to social media. So let's get into it. You got to hang tough with this stuff, right? It's really mind-blowing. It's not easy to accept critical information sometimes. It's not easy to accept that you might be being abused or exploited or used or sold or taken advantage of, but that's part of the enlightenment process. So stay with us on this. And let's start with a definition of political economy. What is political economy? We use those two terms together all the time in this kind of analysis, so that although they are separate terms, right? Political economy analyzes the structural features of capitalism. It analyzes the structural features of capitalism as opposed to not examining capitalism at all. And part of what is examined are the crises that capitalism goes through. We'll get to those later on in the book. But capitalism, as part of its cycle, goes through crises. Along with political economy, we are performing what we call an ideological critique in this class. An ideological critique going along with our analysis of political economy. That's what we've been building up for these first three chapters. An ideological critique analyzes the claims made about reality. An ideological critique examines the claims that are made about reality. Sometimes those claims are very easy to find. Sometimes they are hidden in the content of the media form that's distributing them. And that's what we're going to be getting to later. It's very, very subtle and tiny, this information that is unexamined. And that's what we're going to be using Marx to get at. So Marx said a commodity is the key to capitalism. That's what capitalism's, what he termed cell form is. Like when you talk about a cell, it's the basic unit of a human body. It's your cell, right? We use that term to describe terrorists as well. That's not the way it's being used to describe here. It's being used to describe the core. And he's saying that the core of capitalism, which we are learning about today, continuing to learn about, is commodity, something that can be bought and sold. And commodity structures are naturalized by the system of capitalism. That means capitalism naturalizes the making of money and makes it seem like it's a normal thing that happens every time, and there's no other alternative. And there is, right? If you did any dining experience during the Super Bowl, considering how busy it was, probably you're thinking this is going to affect the tip that I'm giving today. I'm going to need to give a bigger tip to get better service. But think about that very premise, that you're actually paying to get a person who's working for a restaurant to bring you food quicker, or to bring you food that has a better portion on it, or to be nicer to you. You're actually paying in a way to affect the social relations that you have with this other human being. It's a simple example, but we don't examine that. We don't think about that unless you go to another country like England and you try and tip the bartender like, hey, I can't be bought. I'm a nice person by myself. You want to say, hey, here's a drink after work. Get yourself a drink. That's different. So commodity structures are naturalized in the capitalism system. They make it seem like things are natural when that's not necessarily the case. And Fuchs is saying, and that's why this chapter in particular is so hard hitting, Fuchs is saying that we need to analyze the negative aspects of the social media world that exists out there because of the unrestrained optimism that is part of Web 2.0, that it's the web is great, it's going to solve problems, it allows people to connect and share, and blah, blah. That's all Web 2.0 to resurrect it. He says we got to get into criticism. Next, he goes into a series of discussing the limits of all the social media platforms that most people consider to be popular. He talks about the limits of YouTube, the limits of Facebook, the limits of Google, the limits of Twitter. What are the limits? Is these platforms are dominated by entertainment content. Look at them. Look at the top list. You can see tons of tables in this section. It's very interesting. Look and see the top YouTube sites as far as visitors. Look at the top Facebook sites. Look at the top Google searches that go on. The top eight most terms that are searched for on Google are entertainment-oriented terms. They are not about education or politics or about cultural explanation. Entertainment. And the commodification, there's that word, commodity, commodification of entertainment, such as a hip-hop halftime performance show selling you as the product. We're going to get to that. That's what Fuchs is trying to show. These platforms, which have such a reach amongst social media users, they are dominated by entertainment. We've got Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram. You can read for yourself that Kylie Jenner, she's one of the top 10 most searched Instagram. Examples of people who are entertainment oriented. Their job is the attention economy. Have you heard that phrase, the attention economy? Yeah, it's about bringing attention to yourself and making money off of it. That's the attention economy. So many people who do that. That's why they're called YouTube influencers. It's an attention economy, trying to get your attention with entertainment products. Now let's move on to the culture industry. The culture industry, that's what we've been talking about, but now we're going to introduce it more formally. It comes out of sociology. It comes out of some thinkers that made up what was known as the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School existing there in Germany. The thinkers were Max Horkheimer, and we've got Theodor Adorno. These are two of the main thinkers, and they talked about how in capitalism you have the commodification of culture. And what that means is you don't have culture growing up necessarily for the value in and of itself, the meaning of still folding your clothes and after you hang them on a line just because it's a cultural practice rather than putting them in a dryer. What Horkheimer and Adorno are talking about is culture becomes commodified in a capitalist system, that during President's Day weekend, we have President's Day sales that are going on. So the eye is no longer on thinking about the importance of having a president as part of our government. It becomes more about, oh, that's a great day to buy a car, the President's Day weekend. Our culture gets commodified. It gets put into products that can be sold rather than just existing in and of itself. So we have the commodification of culture on social media when it reinforces styles of clothing that should be purchased, when it reinforces thought processes about who should be voted for and therefore who you should give your money to. There's all the examples where money is taking place is the commodification of culture. It's saying what we do with our daily lives is something that can be purchased. It's a commodity, the most important cell of capitalism. And in that process, what happens, and this is the hard part to start accepting, is humans are reduced. Human beings are reduced merely to consumers, customers, and employees. And when you start to get deeper in the book, I think you'll see that there's more to that. You would like to be considered to be more than just a customer and employee or a person who is a commodity in and of itself. We're going to get to that later. It subjects, therefore, human meaning making to the commodity system. That meaning making amongst humans is within the making of money and capital accumulation. And it leaves unquestioned the system of capitalism, whether commodities are actually good for life. Are they good? I mean, I've got a pen right here. I mean, people don't use pens that much, and when they do, they use them for something very rare, and then what happens to them? Goes in the garbage. And then what happens from there? Goes to a landfill. And so this thing that gave like 2 seconds of use and has ink in it, It's got ink both inside and in the color of the blue here, and plastic parts, which will take over 100 years. It's a commodity. It's very convenient for me. It let me write down a phone number that I might have forgotten. But then what happens? It goes and sits in the land for 100 years. Is that good? That's what we're talking about here. Now let's move on to the digital culture industry. That's, after all, where social media exists. And let's just make this statement, as Fuchs does flat out, that large transnational corporations, they control the internet. If I say to you, hey, who's your favorite local nonprofit internet service provider? Who is the social media platform which is the social media platform that you belong to that's nonprofit? Do you have one? Can you even name one? There isn't one in our system, right? Because the internet is dominated by money-making capital accumulation. That's what we're talking about. Capital accumulation companies, yeah. And that leads to a corporate colonization of social media. That means that all across the world, there's this colonization going on where this model is being pushed. It's not the same model in every country. We'll get to other countries later on in the book that have different models, but the internet is predominantly capitalist across the world, not just in the United States. And social media, therefore, do not automatically constitute a public sphere. Now, what is a public sphere and why do we need one? A public sphere is where you can go and spend time and people are not targeting you to make money, and so you can make your own meaning in that world. You can go sit in a square in a park and you can look at the squirrels. You can have a conversation with a relative you haven't seen for a while. You can enjoy a sandwich for lunch. That's a public square. You can see maybe newspapers for sale that you might pick up. That's a public square. The same idea could exist on the internet where you have a place to go and converse. You may consider that it's Reddit right now. You may consider that it's Facebook. That's where you go and talk in public and you ask, hey, how do I get the snow off of my vehicle? Anybody have any quick trips? You may think that's your public sphere. That's what we're going to find out, whether you still believe that by the end of the book. In this kind of sphere where corporate capitalism is dominating social media platforms, entertainment is going to be the content that is commodified. You're not going to have politics. You have politics. You may think that you talk about politics on social media, and maybe you do, and maybe you do it a lot, but it's a very tiny part. And why is politics important? We'll talk about that later in the course as well. So social media are not inherently an expression of neoliberal culture. Neoliberal culture allows for private profit-making, supply and demand. We talked about neoliberal culture. No government, right? New freedom. But social media are not inherently that way, because when they are that way, they become money-making operations. And the only way they become money-making operations is if we decide to go that path and not explore other options, which we'll be looking at in the book. Now let's look at the cycle of capital accumulation so that we can understand how dynamic it is and how it works, right? So we go back to Marx. We go to Marx throughout the book. Marx is the foundational thinker, and we take steps off of him with other thinkers. So Marx had this book. He had many books, but one of his books, Capital, A Critique of Political Economy. That's where we get the terms from his book, A Critique of Political Economy. He says that capital accumulation is dynamic. It's dynamic. It's where money is turned into more money, right? That's what Americans strive for, with pyramid schemes and investment, and purchase a t-shirt business and then try and sell t-shirts to make the business more popular, and then sell the business and make more money off it. Money making more money. It's very dynamic, right? And capital accumulation is dynamic because money is turned into even more money. How is that possible? It doesn't seem possible. So capitalists do that by buying the power of labor power, if you want to think of it that way, the power of labor and the means of production. If you have the two, the factory, in one case, that would be means of production where things are made like t-shirts, and you have the labor. You have employees who are making the t-shirts. That's the two things that you need in place for capitalism. The owners, they own the means of production and they own the power of labor. But is labor having its own rights? Does it have its own equalities in the company? Since without labor, you have no product. If you have no labor, you have no product. So it's the labor that's necessary to make the commodity, the product. And we've got two spheres that we're talking about here, and we're talking about capitalists buying labor and power. One sphere is called the circulation sphere. Now, we're going to get real theoretical with Marx, and you'll even see algebraic numbers in some of the way that Marxist theory is translated. Don't get freaked out. It's heavy for me, believe me, but here's where we're starting to get into it. So we've got the circulation sphere as a one method by which capitalism buys labor, and that's where you have capital is being transformed in the circulation sphere in its value. And so when you use money to buy something in the form of a dollar bill, there is no value in that dollar bill. It's a piece of paper. But that has been transformed into a value that is going to allow you to purchase, what, 1 cup of coffee, maybe, with $1, because the value of that paper has been transformed by the printing process that has placed a value on that versus the 5, which has 5 times that. So there is a transformation that's taken place into this dollar bill. And that's what happens with labor. Labor, the value of labor gets translated into a commodity, and the commodity then gets translated its value into profit. And that profit goes back into investing in some cases, or into revenue or profit or donations. All the time, the values are being transformed. I mean, in the old days, if you were living in the BC part of our world, before Christ, so to speak, you wanted to buy a pig, maybe you bring a snake. You trade a snake for a pig and vice versa. Cash has come out as a transformation of value as part of capital accumulation, and the value of cash is very, very important. Now let's talk about capital accumulation and social media. One of the thinkers cited here is Dallas Smythe, and he says that media companies they're not selling airtime to advertisers, and advertisers are not selling Nike and Geico and Monster.com. That's not what's being sold. What is being sold, according to Smythe, is you, the audience member. Yeah, that's being sold. Because NBC and CBS and Fox and all the other television companies, they say, hey, Geico Insurance, we can sell you males 45 to 54 because we know that they will be watching a classic Super Bowl football game on ESPN2 between the New England Patriots and somebody else. There's an audience for that, and we can sell that audience to you. That's what's going on digital media as well, everybody. It's going on through Facebook and through Google. And so now let's go on to talk about these two. And the premise of the way that Google and Facebook make money is through the use of user-generated content. User-generated content. Facebook and Google, they don't make anything. You make everything. You are being sold. We're going to say that how that happens. We're developing how that happens. The content that's created on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and TikTok and all the rest of them, it's you. You're the one who's creating that. You're the user who's creating that content. So this presents a new wrinkle in previous capital accumulation models. Remember, there is no one capital accumulation model. There are many. You can have subscription services. You can use advertising. You can have buy one, get one free. There's all kinds of ways to make money, right? You know that. So here's another one. But now the content is created by the people who are using the content. How crazy is that? And they are called prosumers. You're a consumer. You're using the internet. You're looking at Facebook, you're looking at Instagram, you're sharing, you're creating TikTok videos, YouTube videos, but you are also consuming at the same time. Isn't that crazy? You're a producer and a consumer. So there's a wrinkle here in the capital accumulation model, and Google and Facebook are dominating. They're dominating. They're at 1/3 of the ad revenue that's made digitally across the world is being sucked up by Google and Facebook. Now let's remind ourselves what Marx says when he says that constant value is the value of resources used in production. That's what constant value is. It's the value of resources used in production. The value of the resources of Facebook and Google was to the tune of $80 billion for Facebook and $160 billion from Google. That's how much money they made in 2020. Even that is a little bit older. Then we also have variable capital. Variable capital is the value of labor power. And that's what we're going to get more into later on in this class, not today, but the value of labor power and asserting itself in the form of unions and other forms of protest to make sure that there's more symmetry in the company. There's another Marxist term we'll be exploring more often, asymmetry and symmetry. Is there symmetry? Is there balance? Or is there asymmetry? Is there an inequality and inequity? All right, so all of this money making that goes on the internet and particularly on social media platforms has just tapped into another version of shadow labor. You know what shadow labor is, right? That's when you have your official people who are working and then you have people who are working for free. You know, like when you go to the grocery store and you check yourself out of the line, or CVS, when you do that, right? You're working for you're working for somebody, you're working for Giant food store when you're bagging your own groceries and checking yourself out. That's shadow labor. And that's what you're doing on the internet. You are working for internet companies, for Facebook and Google. We're going to continuously show that. Another concept that Marx adds here that is of value is the law of value. The law of value. Marx said that the greater the labor time, the greater the value of that labor. The greater the labor time, the greater the value of that. And just think about the internet, how much time people spend on it. And with every keystroke, you're sending data over. You're sending big data over to Facebook and Google. Think about how long you're working for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, depends how many times you're tapping keys on your phone and your keypad. So think of the value of that, the law of value. Marx says there's a lot of value in that you ought to think about. Now, within the social media capital accumulation models taking place out there, other scholars have written about a gendered economy, particularly Eileen Meehan, who talks about discrimination that takes place by the targeting of advertising towards people on Facebook and the products that are going towards females, the beauty products, for example. Looking further, this is not new to social media. We take on these subjects also in the study of legacy traditional media like television and radio, but we look at how products are positioning females to be cosmetic oriented, be putting something on their face all the time. Is that good for them? Similarly over to men smelling good, needing to smell good. Is that stuff good that you're putting on your bodies? Just asking. Marx says we need to ask these questions because if we don't, otherwise they go assumed. Assume that it's okay to put perfume and cologne. Assume that it's okay to put eyeshadow on or put a blush on it. Assumed, right? Is it? That's commodification. We need to say, is it assumed to be a good thing? We need to at least examine that. That's what Marx is saying. Now, all of this leads us to a much larger enterprise trying to address these inequities in capital accumulation in social media and the digital world. And it's the formation of an organization and a movement called the International Division of Labor. The International Division of Labor comes out of the NIDL, which was the first version of it in the 1980s, which is the National International Division of Labor. And it's trying to get at this idea that, let's look at Apple. Apple is the 6th largest company in the world. Probably more than 90% of people in this class have an Apple iPhone. I don't. I have a Samsung, but probably that's how heavy Apple is into dominating your internet experience. The 6th largest company in the world. Big money maker, Apple is. You can look at the revenue figures in the book or look them up on your own. But Apple also has another company, a Chinese company called Foxconn, and those are the workers who put iPhones together. Those are the ones who assemble iPhones in factories, in poorly lit conditions, working very long hours, putting together the device that you're holding in your pocket. And when you look at that company, it's got a terrible rate of suicides. Had 18 suicides in 1 year at this company. There are other parts of the culture at this company where people are yelled at if they don't keep up their pace of work. You can read about it in the book. So that should be looked at. That's what Marxism says you have to look at. You can't look at Web 2.0 and say, this is wonderful. You can have your own brand on Instagram. Yeah, that's part of it, but you have to look at the reality. Congo. Do you know anything about Congo in Africa? In Congo, that's where many of the minerals come from, like titanium, to make your phone. Yeah, there's all kinds of really, really bad chemicals in your phone that are bad for the earth. And what happens to your phone when you're done with it? It gets all cracked up and you throw it away, right? or maybe you trade it in if you're lucky. But how many phones have you thrown away in your life, and what happens to them, including the battery? And what's it? We don't talk about things. It's not pleasant to talk about it, right? We feel guilty, but it's part of the awareness and the insight that comes from this. And so does the collective worker. This was a term that Marx introduced. It's where a worker is working alongside others. And that's what you're doing every time you send a text, every time you share something on social media with somebody else, every time you interact with somebody else, you are working together now. It's not just you working to supply the internet with free labor by the content you're creating in the form of big data. You are doing that with your friends, your followers, the people who like you. Anybody you talk to on the internet, you're doing it with. And there's a relation to digital housework. Digital housework has several forms of labor practices. That's why it's called digital housework. So we've got reproductive labor. Oh, what a terrible way to look at people, but we have to examine the fact that reproductive labor is when another person is born who then contributes to the workforce in the future. It's not an old concept. If you grew up on the farm, you needed somebody to be able to keep the farm going when the elderly people died. That's reproductive labor as well, but it has to be factored into the capitalist model because capitalism relies on it. How many company owners are out there today that you know who are sons and daughters of the person who founded the company? That's what we're talking about, reproductive labor here. And then there's also productive labor. Productive labor is where the labor produces a surplus value, meaning cash and profit. That's a surplus value. When labor creates cash that is extra, it's surplus. Now, the next two sections I'm going to invite you to read on your own. I'm not going to pretend to speak about them with any depth because they are about slavery and racism and capitalism. We have two sections here, and patriarchy. They are really heavy concepts, and only concepts that I believe that can be concepts that can only be considered individually because those terms are so personal to each and every person's experience. Slavery, racism, those two in particular, and patriarchy as well. That's why we get the Black Lives Matter movement. That's why we get diversity training workshops. That's why we get gender conferences. We're trying to overcome these things, but they exist on the internet. To what extent? You have to determine that for yourself, but the point is to raise slavery in the context of exploitation, because that's what Fuchs is starting to argue. Can you tell that people who go on the internet are being exploited because you're working so much for free and you're not getting anything back? You're not getting anything at all. You're just making money for Facebook and Google and Instagram and everybody else. It's a form of exploitation, but it's nowhere near as bad as the exploitation that was conducted by slavery in all its forms. Black African slavery, Egyptian slavery, Jewish slavery, all the slaveries that have taken place across the world. But because in that case, the human mind and the body is private property of the owners. And at least in this kind of a capital accumulation, we don't have that, but it should not be dismissed any less as a form of exploitation that's taking place. So I'm going to invite you to really dig into these two sections on slavery and racism. You can look at similarities between slave labor and exploitive labor. You can look at how patriarchy and fatherly systems tend to dominate capitalist models. You can look at the NFL. Let's swing back to the NFL, the discussion going on right now in the NFL. We have about 13% of the population, if I remember correctly, that are African American, about 19% Latino, by the way. Why don't we have more African American head coaches in the NFL? Is it just bad luck? Is it there aren't as many qualified candidates, or is there something much deeper there in the structure of the form of capitalism that imposes this asymmetry between how many black coaches there should be and how many black coaches there actually are? The NFL is examining that. They're going to bring in an independent agency to study that. But we're taking it on in a way by talking about social media. It's how we started class out, and it's how we're ending it. We're going to have a lot more of this. Don't get too deep, dark, and depressed. There's going to be another way that you can think about accessing social media that comes down the pike that may be possible for you to get into. We'll see about that later on in the class. Have a great day.